On the morning of March 17, 1982, a man named Michael Brennan walked through the front door of his own house in Arlington, Virginia, and knew immediately that something was wrong. Not broken, not disturbed. Wrong. The kitchen smelled like vanilla extract instead of coffee. The curtains were open when they should have been drawn. And the woman standing at the stove, wearing his wife's blue cotton dress, turned to smile at him with a face he had seen 1,000 times before, but eyes he had never met. She said his name the way Sarah always did, soft and relieved. But the word landed in the air between them like a stone dropped into still water. He stood in the doorway with his duffel bag still on his shoulder, fresh off a flight from West Berlin that didn't officially exist, and watched this woman who looked exactly like his wife move toward him with open arms. His training told him to play along. His instinct told him to run. He did neither. He just stood there, frozen, while she kissed his cheek and told him she had missed him. And he realized with cold certainty that the real Sarah was gone. Michael Brennan was not his real name. He had been born David Keller in 1949 in a suburb of Pittsburgh, the son of a steelworker and a schoolteacher. But that life had ended in 1971 when he signed a document in a windowless office in Langley and became someone else. For 11 years he had lived inside the identity of Michael Brennan, an import-export consultant who traveled frequently to Europe, spoke passable German, and had married a librarian named Sarah in 1975. She was real. The marriage was real. The house in Arlington with the blue shutters and the oak tree in the yard was real. Everything else was classified. He worked for the CIA, though not in the way most people imagined it. He didn't carry a gun or wear a disguise or seduce enemy agents in candlelit hotels. He was a signals intelligence officer, a specialist in Soviet communications intercepts, and his job was to sit in concrete bunkers beneath diplomatic buildings and listen to voices on encrypted radio frequencies, translating lies into reports that were read by men he would never meet. It was tedious work, highly technical, and utterly invisible. The kind of work that kept the Cold War cold. Sarah knew he worked for the government. She didn't know which branch or what he did, and she had learned not to ask. That was the agreement they had made early on, an unspoken contract that allowed them to build something resembling a normal life in the margins of his other existence. She was good at not asking. She filled the silence with books and gardening and small routines that made the house feel like a home even when he was gone for weeks at a time. She would meet him at the door with that quiet smile, ask him how the trip was without expecting details, and make him dinner while he sat at the kitchen table trying to remember how to be a husband instead of an operative. They had no children. That had been his decision, made early and never discussed again. He told himself it was for her protection, but the truth was simpler and darker he couldn't imagine bringing. A child into a world where he might vanish one day and never come back, where his entire identity could be erased with a signature on a form marked secret. So they had each other. And the house in the careful fiction that they were just another couple living just another American life in the shadow of the capital. He had left for Berlin 6 weeks earlier, in early February, on an assignment that was supposed to last 2 months. The East Germans had installed new encryption hardware at a listening post near Potsdam, and the agency wanted someone on the ground to analyze the signal patterns and determine if the Soviets had upgraded their cipher protocols. It was grunt work, the kind of assignment they gave to mid-level officers who were too experienced to waste, but not senior enough to trust with anything glamorous. He spent his days in a basement room beneath the U.S. mission in West Berlin, headphones clamped over his ears, scribbling notes on yellow legal pads while voices spoke in Russian about troop movements and supply, schedules and the tedious bureaucracy of empire. At night he slept in a safe house near Tempelhof Airport, a one-bedroom apartment with thin walls and a view of nothing, and tried not to think about Sarah alone in Arlington, watering the plants and reading under the lamp in the living room. Then, on March 10th, something happened. He was running a routine frequency sweep when he picked up a transmission that didn't fit the pattern. It was brief, less than 30 seconds, and heavily encrypted. But there was something in the cadence that caught his attention. He flagged it for analysis, ran it through the decryption protocols, and got back a partial translation that made him sit up straighter in his chair. The message referenced an operation codenamed Mirror, which he had never heard of, and mentioned a location in Virginia. That was unusual. Soviet communications about operations inside the United States were rare and always handled with extreme caution, rooted through layers of cutouts and dead drops that made them nearly impossible to trace. This one had been broadcast openly, as if the sender didn't care who was listening or wanted someone to hear. He filed a report with his handler, a taciturn case officer named Harris who ran the Berlin station from an office that smelled like stale cigarettes and disappointment. Harris told him to forget about it. Not in those words, but the message was clear. Some things were above his clearance level. Some doors stayed closed. Michael forgot about it for 3 days. Then, on March 13th, he was pulled from the listening post and told to pack his things. His rotation was being cut short. No explanation, no debriefing, just a plane ticket back to Dulles and instructions to report to Langley within 48 hours of arrival. He asked Harris what was going on, but Harris just shook his head and said it wasn't his call. Michael had been in the game long enough to know what that meant. Someone higher up the chain had made a decision, and the reasons didn't matter. Orders were orders. He caught a military transport out of Tempelhof on the evening of March 14th, slept badly on the flight across the Atlantic, and landed at Dulles on the morning of March 17th with a headache and a bad feeling that he couldn't name. He didn't go to Langley. He went home first, telling himself he wanted to see Sarah, to ground himself in something real before he walked back into the machine. That's what he told himself. But the truth, which he wouldn't admit until much later, was that he already knew something was wrong. He just didn't know how wrong. The house looked the same from the outside. The oak tree was beginning to bud, the lawn needed mowing, and the blue shutters were freshly painted, which surprised him because Sarah had been complaining about them peeling for months. He walked up the driveway with his duffel bag and used his key to open the front door. And that's when the wrongness hit him like a fist to the chest. The smell, the light, the silence that wasn't quite silence but something heavier, like the air inside a church or a museum. He stepped into the hallway and set down his bag, listening. The house was too quiet. Sarah always played music when she was home, classical piano or old jazz records, something to fill the empty rooms. Now there was nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. He walked toward the kitchen, his footsteps loud on the hardwood floor, and that's when he saw her, standing at the stove, wearing the blue dress. Turning to smile at him with that face that was hers but wasn't, she looked perfect. That was the first thing he noticed. Her hair was the same shade of auburn, cut to the same length, falling just past her shoulders. Her eyes were the same green, flecked with gold. Her mouth curved into the same smile she had given him on their wedding day, shy and warm and full of something that looked like love. But perfection was the problem. Sarah was not a perfect woman. She had a scar on her left hand from a gardening accident, a thin white line that ran from her thumb to her wrist. This woman's hand was unmarked. Sarah had a habit of biting her lower lip when she was nervous, leaving a faint red mark that would stay for hours. This woman's lips were smooth and unblemished. Sarah moved through the world with a kind of absent grace, always slightly distracted, her mind halfway inside whatever book she was reading. This woman moved with purpose, every gesture deliberate and rehearsed, like an actress who had studied the role but couldn't quite capture the soul beneath the lines. She spoke with Sarah's voice, but the cadence was wrong, the pauses too calculated. She smiled with Sarah's mouth, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. And when she reached out to touch his face, her hand was cold. He didn't pull away. His training kicked in, the part of him that had been trained to lie, to smile, to pretend that everything was fine even when the world was burning. He set down his duffel bag and let her embrace him, feeling her arms around his shoulders and the press of her body against his. And all the while his mind was racing, cataloging every detail, every inconsistency, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. She asked him how the trip was. He said it was fine. She said she'd been worried about him, that he'd been gone longer than expected. He nodded, said there had been delays, bureaucratic nonsense, nothing to worry about. She asked if he was hungry. He said yes, even though his stomach was a knot of ice. She turned back to the stove and began cooking eggs, humming softly to herself, and he stood there in the kitchen of his own house, watching this stranger who wore his wife's face, and tried to decide what to do next. The smart thing would have been to leave immediately, to walk out the door and drive straight to Langley and report what he had seen. But he couldn't do that. Not yet. Because if he was right, if this woman was not Sarah, then the question wasn't who she was, but where Sarah had gone. And if the agency had done this, if they had taken his wife and replaced her with a double, then walking into Langley might be the last thing he ever did. He needed to know more. He needed proof. So, he stayed. He sat down at the kitchen table and ate the eggs she had made, which tasted like nothing, and answered her questions with carefully constructed lies, and watched her move through the familiar rhythms of their life together. And all the while he was searching for cracks in the facade, for some sign that would tell him who she really was and what had happened to the woman he loved. The house was wrong in 1,000 small ways. The books on the shelves were organized differently, alphabetized instead of grouped by subject the way Sarah always kept them. The coffee mugs in the cupboard were arranged neatly in rows instead of jumbled together in the casual chaos Sarah preferred. The refrigerator was stocked with groceries that Sarah never bought, low-fat milk instead of whole, wheat bread instead of rye, margarine instead of butter. Small things, meaningless things. But together they formed a pattern, a picture of a life that looked like his, but had been subtly rewritten, like a document with words replaced so carefully that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for them. He walked through the rooms, touching things, opening drawers, checking closets, and everywhere he looked he found evidence of erasure. Sarah's favorite cardigan, the green one with the loose button, was gone. The photograph of her mother, which she always kept on her nightstand, had been replaced with a different picture in the same frame. A woman who looked similar but wasn't quite right, the smile too broad, the eyes too dark. Even the sheets on their bed had been changed. Crisp white linens instead of the pale blue ones Sarah had bought at a yard sale and loved because they were soft and worn. It was as if someone had taken his life and tried to recreate it from a set of instructions, getting all the big details right but missing the texture, the lived-in imperfection that made it real. He asked her about the photograph. Casual, just making conversation. She glanced at it and said it was her mother, the same as always, and looked at him with a faint expression of concern, as if she thought he might be tired or confused. He didn't press. He just nodded and let it go, and felt the cold certainty settling deeper into his bones. This woman believed she was Sarah, or she had been trained to believe it. Or she knew the truth and was playing a role, waiting for him to break, to reveal himself, to make a mistake. He didn't know which possibility was worse. That night he lay awake beside her in the dark, listening to her breathe. She slept on her right side, the way Sarah did, curled toward him with one hand tucked under the pillow. But Sarah snored softly, a gentle, rhythmic sound that had kept him awake on their honeymoon until he learned to find it comforting. This woman breathed silently, each inhalation and exhalation perfectly measured, as if even in sleep she was aware of being watched. He stared at the ceiling and tried to think. If this was an agency operation, what was the purpose? To test him? To replace him? To turn him into an asset, someone they could control through fear and confusion? Or was it something else, something worse, a contingency plan that had been set in motion because of something he had seen or heard in Berlin? The transmission, mirror, the message that had been broadcast too openly, as if it was meant to be intercepted. He had filed a report. Harris had told him to forget about it. And 3 days later, he was pulled out and sent home to find his wife replaced by a stranger who knew everything about his life except how to live it. The next morning, she made him breakfast pancakes, which Sarah had never made because she didn't like sweet things in the morning, and told him she had taken the day off from work so they could spend time together. He asked about the library, and she said everything was fine, the same as always, and described a coworker he had never heard of and a project that didn't match anything Sarah had ever mentioned. He nodded and ate the pancakes and felt the noose tightening around his throat. She was good. Whoever she was, whatever training she had received, it was thorough. She knew his habits, his schedule, the names of his supposed colleagues at the import-export firm that didn't exist. She knew how he took his coffee, and which newspaper he read, and that he always left his keys on the hook by the door. She had been briefed on every visible detail of his life. But she didn't know Sarah. She didn't know the invisible things, the private language that develops between two people who have shared a bed and a life for 7 years. She didn't know that Sarah always kissed him on the left side of his jaw, just below his ear, or that she hummed the same 3 bars of a Mozart sonata when she was anxious, or that she had a fear of thunderstorms that went back to childhood and would sometimes wake him in the middle of the night just to hold his hand until the weather passed. This woman did none of those things. She was a perfect copy of the surface and a void beneath. He told her he had to go into the office, that there were reports to file and meetings to attend. She smiled and said she understood and kissed him on the mouth, a brief, dry kiss that Sarah would never have given, because Sarah always kissed him deeply when he left, as if she was trying to memorize the taste of him in case he didn't come back. He drove to Langley with his hands tight on the wheel and his mind spinning through possibilities, each one darker than the last. He signed in at the gate, parked in the underground garage, and took the elevator up to the 3rd floor where his department was housed. A maze of cubicles and locked doors where men in shirt sleeves typed classified reports and women in sensible shoes carried folders marked with colored tabs that indicated levels of secrecy. His desk was, as he had left it, clean and anonymous. The surface empty except for a telephone and a lamp and a small plastic tray for incoming paperwork. There was nothing in the tray. He sat down and waited. Harris found him 20 minutes later. He appeared in the doorway of Michael's cubicle, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed and a cigarette dangling from his lips, even though smoking was technically prohibited inside the building. Harris was in his 50s. A career officer who had spent his youth running agents in Budapest and Prague and Berlin before being promoted to a desk job he clearly resented. He had the weary, cynical look of a man who had seen too much and believed in too little, and he regarded Michael with an expression that might have been pity or contempt or simple exhaustion. "Welcome back," Harris said. His voice was flat, uninflected, the tone of someone delivering news that had already been decided and couldn't be changed. "What happened?" Michael asked. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He had learned early that Harris respected directness, or at least tolerated it more than false courtesy. "You tell me," Harris said. He took a drag on his cigarette and exhaled slowly, the smoke curling toward the ceiling. "How was the homecoming?" Michael felt his pulse quicken. The question was too specific, too pointed. It wasn't casual. It was a test. "Fine," he said carefully. "Sarah was happy to see me. I'm sure she was." Harris studied him for a long moment, his eyes cold and unreadable. Then he pushed off the doorframe and jerked his head toward the hallway. "Come with me. We need to talk." They walked in silence through the corridors, past offices where people pretended not to notice them, and took an elevator down to the basement level where the secure conference rooms were located. Harris led him into a windowless room with gray walls and a metal table and 2 chairs, the kind of space designed to make you feel small and exposed. He closed the door and gestured for Michael to sit. Michael sat. Harris remained standing, leaning against the wall, still smoking his cigarette as if he didn't care that there was no ashtray and nowhere for the ash to fall except the floor. "You picked up something in Berlin," Harris said. It wasn't a question. "A transmission," Michael said. "I filed a report. I know. I read it." Harris took another drag and watched him through the smoke. "Mirror that ring any bells?" "No." "Good. It shouldn't." Harris tapped ash onto the floor and ground it under his heel. That's the kind of thing that lives above your pay grade, way above. The kind of thing that people like you and me aren't supposed to know about because knowing about it makes us liabilities. Then why are we talking about it? Because you're already compromised, Harris said bluntly. The moment you intercepted that transmission, you became a problem. And problems get solved. Michael felt the cold creeping up his spine. The same cold he had felt standing in his kitchen watching a stranger cook eggs in his wife's dress. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice low and tight. Harris looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something that might have been regret. "It wasn't my call," he said finally. "Orders came from upstairs. Way upstairs. They pulled you out of Berlin before you could dig any deeper, and they addressed the situation at home." Addressed. The word tasted like poison. What does that mean? Harris didn't answer. He just looked at him. And in that silence, Michael understood everything. "Where is she?" Michael's voice was barely a whisper now, tight with fury and fear. "Where's Sarah? Safe," Harris said. "That's all I can tell you. She's safe, she's alive, and she'll stay that way as long as you cooperate." "Cooperate with what?" "With the way things are now." Harris stubbed out his cigarette against the wall and let it fall to the floor. "You go home. You live your life. You do your job. You forget about Mir, and you forget about Berlin, and you accept that the woman in your house is your wife. Because as far as the rest of the world is concerned, she is. All the paperwork says so. Her ID, her social security number, her employment records, it all matches. Perfect. She's been placed there for a reason, and that reason is classified, and you don't get to know it. What you get to know is this. If you try to dig deeper, if you try to find her, if you do anything except play along, then Sarah stops being safe. Do you understand?" Michael stared at him, his hands clenched into fists on the table, his whole body trembling with rage and helplessness. "You can't do this. We already did." Harris met his gaze without flinching. "This is the world we live in, Brennan. This is the price of keeping the peace. You think you're special? You think you're the first person this has happened to? You're not. You're just another piece on the board, and the board is bigger than you can imagine. Now you have a choice. You can accept it and live, or you can fight it and lose everything, including her." The room was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system and the sound of Michael's breathing, harsh and uneven in his throat. He wanted to lunge across the table and wrap his hands around Harris's neck. He wanted to scream, he wanted to run, but he did none of those things because he knew Harris was right. He was already compromised. He had been compromised the moment he signed his life away in that windowless office 11 years ago. There was no escape. There was no justice. There was only survival, and survival meant obedience. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally, his voice hollow. "Go home," Harris said. "Be a husband. Do your job. Live the life they've given you. And forget about the woman you used to know because she's gone. She's been replaced. And if you want her to stay alive, you'll accept that." Michael stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. He looked at Harris, this man who had been his handler and something like a mentor, and saw only emptiness. No guilt, no shame, just the tired resignation of someone who had made these kinds of choices too many times and stopped feeling them. "One question," Michael said. Harris nodded. "Why her? Why Sarah?" Harris smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because she was leverage," he said. "And now she still is. That's how this works, Brennan. We own you. We've always owned you. We just wanted to make sure you remembered." Michael walked out of the room, out of the building, into the cold March sunlight that felt like mockery. He drove home through traffic that seemed unreal, past people living ordinary lives who had no idea what happened in the spaces between the lies. He parked in his driveway and sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the house with the blue shutters and the oak tree beginning to bloom, and tried to imagine how he was supposed to walk through that door and pretend that nothing had changed. But something had changed. Everything had changed. The woman inside was not his wife. His wife was somewhere else, held prisoner by the same people he worked for, the same people he had trusted to protect him. And he had no way to reach her, no way to save her, no way to even know if Harris had been telling the truth about her being alive. He got out of the car. He walked to the door. He used his key. And when he stepped inside, she was there in the hallway, smiling that perfect smile, asking him how his day was, reaching for his hand. He let her take it. He let her kiss his cheek. He let her lead him into the kitchen where she had made dinner, and he sat at the table and ate food that tasted like nothing, and answered her questions, and played his part in the terrible theater of his new life. The days that followed took on the quality of a nightmare from which he could not wake. Michael went through the motions of his life like a man moving underwater. Every action slow and deliberate and muffled by the weight of what he knew. He went to work at Langley, sat at his desk, filed reports on signals intelligence that no longer seemed to matter. He came home to the house in Arlington where the woman who was not Sarah waited for him, with dinner and conversation and the careful performance of intimacy. He slept beside her in the dark and felt the distance between them like a physical thing, a chasm that grew wider every night. And all the while he searched for answers that refused to come. He tried to find traces of the real Sarah in the house, anything she might have left behind that would prove she had been there, that she had been real. But there was nothing. Every photograph had been replaced. Every piece of clothing that belonged distinctly to her had vanished. Every small object that carried her fingerprints or her handwriting or the particular way she had arranged things had been removed. It was a surgical erasure, professional and complete. The woman who lived with him now had her own things, identical in style but subtly different in detail. And they filled the spaces where Sarah's possessions had been like forgeries replacing originals in a museum. He found himself studying these objects with an archaeologist's intensity, searching for inconsistencies. But whoever had planned this operation had been thorough. They had thought of everything. The woman herself was harder to read. She never broke character, never slipped, never gave him any opening to confront her directly. She went to work at the library where Sarah had worked, came home at the same time Sarah had come home, spoke about colleagues Sarah had mentioned and events Sarah had attended. When he tested her with questions about their past, she answered correctly every time, reciting details from his life that only Sarah should have known. Their first date, the restaurant where he had proposed, the argument they'd had about buying the house, she knew all of it. Not just the facts, but the emotional texture, the way Sarah would have remembered them. It was uncanny. It was perfect. And it confirmed what he had already suspected. This was not a hastily arranged substitution. This was a long-term operation, planned and executed with resources that went far beyond anything a single case officer or station could authorize. This was institutional. This was policy. This was the machinery of the state turning its full attention on a single target, Heman reshaping his reality with surgical precision. He tried to make contact with Harris, but Harris was suddenly unavailable. His calls went unanswered. His attempts to schedule meetings were politely deflected by secretaries who told him Harris was in conference, or out of the office, or dealing with urgent matters that required his full attention. After a week of this, Michael stopped trying. The message was clear: he was on his own. Whatever Harris had told him in that gray basement room was all the information he would ever receive. The rest was silence. So he began his own investigation, carefully and quietly, using the skills he had learned over 11 years of intelligence work. He started with the woman herself. He watched her when she thought he wasn't looking, cataloging her habits and mannerisms, searching for tells. She was good, but nobody was perfect. She had been trained to mimic Sarah's behavior, but training could only go so far. There were gaps, moments when the mask slipped just slightly. She laughed at jokes Sarah would have found silly. She chose books from the shelf that Sarah had never read. She made comments about movies and music that didn't match Sarah's tastes, small things, meaningless to anyone who didn't know Sarah intimately. But Michael knew Sarah intimately, or he had, and these discrepancies confirmed what he already knew while telling him nothing useful about who this woman really was. He tried a different approach. He began leaving markers around the house, tiny tests to see if she would notice. He rearranged books on the shelf in a specific pattern. He left a coffee cup in a particular spot on the kitchen counter. He placed a pen at a precise angle on the desk in the study. Each morning he checked them. Each morning they had been moved. Not dramatically, just enough to erase his patterns and restore what she believed was the proper order. Someone was monitoring his behavior. Someone was watching to see if he would try to communicate, to leave messages, to signal his awareness of the situation. The house, he realized, was not a home anymore. It was a stage, and they were both actors playing roles for an audience he couldn't see. He stopped sleeping. Or rather, he pretended to sleep while lying awake beside her, listening to the house settle around them, analyzing every sound for meaning. The woman who was not Sarah slept deeply and dreamlessly, her breathing measured and calm. Sarah had been a restless sleeper, prone to nightmares she wouldn't remember in the morning, but that left her tangled in the sheets and reaching for him in the dark. This woman never moved, never cried out, never reached for anything. She slept like someone who had been trained to sleep lightly, to wake at the slightest disturbance, ready to respond. He wondered if she was armed. He wondered if she had been trained to kill him if he became a problem. He wondered if she had already killed the real Sarah. That thought came to him late one night in early April, 3 weeks after his return from Berlin, and it lodged in his chest like a shard of ice. Harris had said Sarah was alive, that she would stay alive as long as he cooperated. But Harris had also lied to him for 11 years about the nature of his work, about the operations he had been part of, about the people he had helped surveil and sometimes destroy. Why should he believe Harris now? Why should he trust that the agency, which had proven itself capable of replacing his wife with a stranger, would keep its word about anything? The truth was simpler and darker. He had no guarantee that Sarah was alive. He had only Harris's word, and Harris's word was worth nothing. He began to think about escape. Not for himself. He knew there was no escape for him. No place he could go that the agency couldn't reach, but for Sarah, wherever she was. If she was still alive, she was being held somewhere, probably in a facility designed to house assets and defectors and people who knew too much and had to be kept silent. The agency had dozens of such places, scattered across the country and around the world, hidden inside military bases and private estates and buildings that looked like offices or hospitals or research centers. Finding her would be nearly impossible. But nearly impossible was not the same as impossible, and he had spent his career learning how to do impossible things quietly and without leaving traces. He started with the only lead he had, Mirror. The operation he had intercepted in Berlin, the transmission that had mentioned Virginia. If Sarah's disappearance was connected to that operation, and it had to be. The timing was too precise to be coincidence, then understanding. Mira might tell him where she was and why they had taken her. He couldn't access classified files at Langley without leaving a digital trail. But he could reconstruct information from what he already knew and what he could observe. He began making notes in a cipher of his own design, recording fragments of conversations he had overheard. Names mentioned in briefings, references to programs and budgets and personnel movements. He hid these notes in places the watchers wouldn't think to look, inside the binding of books, beneath the insulation in the attic, taped to the underside of furniture. He worked slowly, methodically, building a picture piece by piece. What emerged was fragmentary, but suggestive. Mirror appeared to be a domestic counterintelligence operation, something involving the replacement of individuals who had been compromised or were considered security risks. The goal was not to arrest or interrogate them, that would attract attention, create problems, but to neutralize them by removing them from circulation and substituting controlled replacements who could be monitored and managed. It was elegant in its brutality. Instead of eliminating problems, the agency was replacing them, turning potential liabilities into assets while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Michael himself was proof of concept. His life continued as before, his job continued as before. But now he was completely controlled, his every action monitored, his every relationship compromised. He was a puppet, and the woman who was not Sarah was one of the strings. But why? That was the question he couldn't answer. What had he done? What had he seen? What did he know that made him dangerous enough to require this level of control? The transmission from Berlin was part of it, but it couldn't be all of it. There had to be something else, something deeper, something he had stumbled onto without realizing it. He reviewed his work from the past year, all the signals he had intercepted and translated, all the reports he had filed. Most of it was routine. Troop movements, supply schedules, communications between Soviet field officers and their handlers. Nothing that seemed significant. Nothing that would justify what had been done to him. Unless the point was not what he had found, but what he might find. Unless they were worried not about what he knew, but about what he might discover. That made a terrible kind of sense. If Mirror was a widespread operation, if the agency was replacing people across the government and military and intelligence community, then anyone with the skills to notice inconsistencies, anyone with training in signals analysis, pattern recognition, anomaly detection would be a threat. Michael had spent his career finding patterns in noise, identifying signals that didn't belong. If he started looking at his own life, at the people around him, with that same analytical lens, he might see things he wasn't supposed to see. So they had given him something else to focus on, his missing wife. They had replaced Sarah not just to control him, but to distract him. To keep his attention fixed on a personal tragedy rather than a systemic operation. It was brilliant, it was cruel, and it was working. By mid-April, he had compiled enough information to form a hypothesis. Mirror was not a single operation but a program. An ongoing effort to infiltrate and control key positions within the national security apparatus by replacing individuals with trained operatives who looked like them, sounded like them, and could pass for them in every observable way. The replacements were not Soviet agents. That would be too risky, too easy to detect, but agency assets, Americans who had been recruited and trained for this specific purpose. They were sleepers, but not in the traditional sense. They weren't waiting to be activated. They were already active, living the lives of the people they had replaced. Gathering intelligence, influencing decisions, and maintaining the illusion of normalcy while serving an agenda that remained hidden even from most of the people who worked for the agency itself. It was the perfect paranoia machine. Once you started looking for replacements, you saw them everywhere. Every inconsistency became suspicious. Every change in behavior became evidence. You couldn't trust anyone, not your colleagues, not your friends, not even yourself, because how would you know if your own memories had been altered, your own identity compromised? Michael felt himself slipping into that darkness. The paranoid spiral that consumed people who spent too long in the intelligence world. He forced himself to stop, to step back, to focus on what he could verify rather than what he could imagine. But the damage was done. He no longer trusted his own perceptions. He no longer believed in the reality around him. Everything was suspect. Everything was potentially false. And yet he had to continue. He had to play the role they had assigned him, to be the loyal husband and the dutiful officer, while searching for a way to reach Sarah. To confirm she was alive, to find some leverage that would allow him to negotiate her release, or at least her safety. He knew it was probably futile. He knew that people like him, people who knew too much and had outlived their usefulness, didn't get happy endings. But he had to try. He owed her that much. He owed himself that much. In early May, he made his first mistake. He came home from work one evening and found the woman who was not Sarah cooking dinner, and for a moment, just a moment, he let his guard down. He was tired, exhausted from weeks of sleeplessness and stress, and he forgot to maintain the pretense. She asked him how his day was, and instead of giving the usual non-committal answer, he said nothing. He just stood there in the doorway, looking at her, and something in his expression must have betrayed him, because she stopped stirring the pot on the stove and turned to face him with a look that was not Sarah's look. Not warm and concerned, but cold and evaluating. She studied him for a long moment, and he saw the calculation in her eyes. The assessment of threat, the decision tree branching in her mind. Then she smiled, that perfect smile, and asked if everything was all right. He said yes. He said he was just tired. She nodded and turned back to the stove, and the moment passed, but he knew she had seen something. He had revealed himself just slightly, and now they would be watching him even more closely. That night, lying awake beside her, he made a decision. He could not find Sarah on his own. He did not have the resources, the access, the freedom of movement required to locate a prisoner held in a classified facility somewhere in the continental United States. But he knew someone who might. Someone who operated outside the official channels, who had connections in the intelligence community but was not bound by its rules, who owed him a favor and might be willing to help if approached correctly. The problem was making contact without being detected. Every phone call he made was logged. Every letter he sent was opened. Every person he met with was noted and reported. He would have to be clever. He would have to take risks. But he had run out of other options. The person he was thinking of was a woman named Elena Vasquez, a former case officer who had left the agency under murky circumstances 5 years earlier. They had worked together briefly in the late 70s, when she was running agents in Latin America and he was providing signals intelligence support from a desk in Langley. She had been good at her job, too good, and she had seen things that made her uncomfortable. Operations that crossed lines that were supposed to exist even in the shadow world of intelligence work. She had asked questions. She had pushed back. And eventually, she had been offered a choice: resign quietly and keep her pension, or be terminated with prejudice and face potential prosecution for unauthorized disclosure of classified information. She had chosen resignation. She had moved to Baltimore, opened a small private investigation firm, and severed all visible ties to her former life. But Michael knew she still had contacts, people who trusted her and would feed her information because they respected what she had tried to do, even if it had cost her everything. He found a way to contact her in late May. He took a day off work, told the woman who was not Sarah he had a doctor's appointment, and drove north to Baltimore in a rental car he had paid for with cash. He did not use his phone. He did not tell anyone where he was going. He parked 3 blocks from Elena's office and walked the rest of the way, checking constantly for surveillance, using every counter-surveillance technique he knew. If they were following him, and they probably were, he wanted to make them work for it, to create enough uncertainty that his eventual destination would be ambiguous. He entered her building through a side door, took the stairs instead of the elevator, and knocked on the frosted glass door that read Vasquez Investigations in faded black letters. She opened the door herself. She was older than he remembered, her dark hair streaked with gray, her face lined with the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much and believing too little. But her eyes were sharp, and when she saw him standing there, recognition and weariness crossed her face in equal measure. "Michael Brennan," she said. She didn't sound surprised. She sounded resigned, as if she had been expecting this visit for years and was disappointed it had finally come. "You look like hell." "I need your help," he said. She looked past him into the hallway, checking for anyone who might have followed. Then she stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. "Come in. But if you're bringing trouble, I need to know now." "I'm bringing trouble," he said. "I'm sorry." She closed the door behind him and locked it. Her office was small and cluttered, the walls lined with filing cabinets, and the desk covered with papers and coffee cups and the accumulated debris of a one-person operation struggling to stay afloat. She sat down behind the desk and gestured for him to take the chair across from her. He sat. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then she said, "What happened?" He told her everything. He had not planned to. It violated every rule of compartmentalization he had ever learned, but once he started talking, he couldn't stop. He told her about Berlin, about the transmission, about coming home to find Sarah replaced. He told her about Harris and the basement room, and the threat disguised as an explanation. He told her about Mirror, about his suspicions, about the slow disintegration of his grip on reality. He laid it all out, every detail, every fear, and when he was finished he sat back in the chair and waited for her to tell him he was insane, that he had cracked, that he needed help of a different kind. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if what he had told her confirmed something she had suspected for a long time. "Mirror," she said quietly. "I've heard whispers. Nothing concrete, but enough to know it's real, or was real at some point. A program to replace people in sensitive positions with controlled assets. I always thought it was Cold War paranoia taken to its logical extreme, but if they did it to you, ... double quotes, she trailed off, thinking. Then she looked at him with an expression that was almost kind. "Your wife is probably alive," she said. "They wouldn't kill her. She's too valuable as leverage. But finding her is going to be nearly impossible." "Will you try?" he asked. She studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do if I find her? You can't rescue her. You can't go to the press. You can't even talk about this without disappearing. So what's the end game here, Michael?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I just need to know she's alive. I need to know she's okay. And then, I don't know." Alina leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She looked exhausted, defeated, as if the weight of the world he had just described was more than she wanted to carry. But when she opened her eyes again, there was steel in them. "I'll make some calls," she said. "No promises. And if I find something, I'm not going to tell you over the phone or in person. It'll be a dead drop. Old school. You remember how that works?" He nodded. "Good. Check the hollow tree in Rock Creek Park, the one near the footbridge. You know the one I'm talking about?" "I know it. Give me 2 weeks. If I find anything, it'll be there." She stood up, and he understood the meeting was over. "And Michael? Don't come back here. Don't call me. Don't try to contact me again. If this works, great. If it doesn't, we never had this conversation. Understood?"
"Understood."
He left the way he had come, down the stairs and out the side door, and drove back to Arlington feeling hollowed out and strangely lighter, as if confessing his nightmare to someone who believed him had released some of the pressure that had been building in his chest for weeks. He returned the rental car, went home, and found the woman who was not Sarah waiting for him with dinner and questions about his appointment. He told her it had gone fine, nothing to worry about, just a routine checkup. She smiled and kissed his cheek and told him she was glad. And that night, when they lay in bed together in the dark, he thought about Sarah somewhere far away, alone and afraid. And he made a silent promise that he would not stop looking until he knew the truth. 2 weeks later, on a humid afternoon in early June, Michael walked through Rock Creek Park as if he were just another office worker taking a break from the stifling buildings of Washington. He followed the trail along the creek, past joggers and families and tourists, until he reached the old footbridge. The hollow tree was nearby. A massive oak with a cavity at chest height that generations of Cold War operatives had used as a dead drop. He approached it casually, pretending to admire the view, and slipped his hand inside. His fingers touched paper. He palmed it, continued walking, and didn't look at it until he was safely inside his car, parked on a side street 3 miles away. The note was brief, written in Elena's tight, precise handwriting. Facility designation Blackwood. Appalachian region. No exact location. She's there. She's alive. Monitored 24/7. Extraction impossible. I'm sorry. He read it 3 times. Then he ate the paper, chewing it slowly until it dissolved into pulp he could swallow. He sat in his car with the windows down and the sound of traffic passing, and let himself feel, just for a moment, the enormity of what he had learned. Sarah was alive. She was being held in a facility called Blackwood. Somewhere in the mountains of Appalachia, guarded and watched and kept alive as leverage against his obedience. He could not reach her. He could not free her. But he knew she existed. And knowing that changed everything. The woman who was not Sarah was waiting for him when he got home. She asked where he had been. He said he had gone for a drive, needed to clear his head. She accepted this without comment. They ate dinner in silence. That night, he lay awake beside her and thought about the real Sarah. Hundreds of miles away in some concrete cell or dormitory or whatever shape her prison took, and he wondered if she thought about him, if she knew he was looking for her, if she had given up hope. He wondered how long the agency planned to keep her there, whether they would ever let her go, whether she would grow old in that place, forgotten by everyone except him. He wondered if he would ever see her again. And as the weeks turned into months, and the summer heat gave way to autumn, Michael Brennan continued to live his assigned life, playing his role, maintaining the fiction, while carrying inside himself a knowledge that burned like a coal that would never go out. The woman who was not Sarah grew more comfortable in her role, more confident, and he grew more distant, more hollow, a ghost inhabiting his own existence. He went to work. He came home. He slept beside a stranger. And every night before he closed his eyes, he thought about Blackwood and the woman imprisoned there. And he made the same silent promise: I have not forgotten you. I will never forget you. The Cold War had many casualties, but they were not all counted in body bags or diplomatic cables or strategic victories. Some casualties were quieter, more intimate, losses that occurred in suburban kitchens and anonymous bedrooms where the machinery of the state reached into people's lives and rewrote them with surgical precision. Michael Brennan was one such casualty. Sarah Brennan was another. And the woman who wore Sarah's face and lived in her house and slept in her bed was a third. Though she would never know it, because she believed the lies she had been trained to live. Years later, after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War officially ended, a researcher going through declassified agency files would find a brief reference to an operation codenamed Mirror. The file was heavily redacted, almost unreadable, but it confirmed that such a program had existed and that it had been terminated in 1985. Deemed too risky and ethically problematic to continue. The file made no mention of individual cases or the fates of those who had been subjected to the program. Their stories remained classified, locked away in archives that would never be opened. Secrets buried so deeply that they might as well have never existed at all. But they did exist. And if you listen carefully, if you pay attention to the silences between the official histories and the gaps in the public record, you can still hear their echoes. Michael Brennan never saw Sarah again. He lived out his career at the agency, retired in 1995, and died of a heart attack in 2003. Alone in the house in Arlington where he had spent 21 years living with a woman who was not his wife. The woman who was not Sarah stayed in character until the end, mourning him at his funeral, selling the house, moving to Florida to begin a new assignment, or perhaps to retire from whatever service she had rendered. The real Sarah's fate remains unknown. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile trust really was during those decades when the world balanced on the edge of annihilation, when governments justified any action in the name of security and people disappeared into systems that erased them as efficiently as fire erases paper, then perhaps there is value in telling them. Not because they offer comfort or resolution, but because they remind us that history is not just treaties and summits and grand strategic moves, but also the small, terrible things done to ordinary people in the name of something larger than themselves. There are many more Cold War stories that should never be forgotten, not because they are heroic, but because they are true.